Hey there, mystery lovers. Have you ever wondered what really happened on those old southern plantations when the sun went down and shadows grew long? Today, I'm bringing you a story that will chill you to the bone, a tale from 1855 Alabama that blurs the line between supernatural terror and human cruelty. If you're ready to dive into this dark mystery, make sure to subscribe to the channel, hit that share button, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I love connecting with viewers from around the world. Now let's step back in time to a place where whispers carried more power than screams, and where one woman's desperation would unleash something that defied all explanation. The morning mist clung to the cotton fields of Blackwood Plantation, like the ghosts of forgotten prayers. Master Edmund Blackwood stood on his mansion's wraparound porch, surveying his domain with the cold satisfaction of a man who believed God had blessed him with dominion over lesser beings. The year was 1855, and in the heart of Alabama, his word was law, his will absolute. Below in the quarters, the enslaved people of Blackwood Plantation began another day that promised nothing but suffering. The wooden shacks, weathered grey by countless storms, housed families torn apart by sale, children who would never know freedom, and souls crushed under the weight of endless labour. Among them moved a woman whose very presence seemed to shift the air around her. They called her Seraphina, though that wasn't the name her mother had whispered to her in those precious first moments of life. She was perhaps 30 years old, with skin the colour of rich earth and eyes that held depths no amount of brutality could empty. What set her apart wasn't just her striking beauty or her quiet dignity. It was the way other enslaved people looked at her when they thought no one was watching. There was reverence there and fear, and something that looked dangerously like hope. Overseer Marcus Whitmore cracked his whip against his leather boots as he surveyed the morning assembly. He was a man built like a bull, with hands that had never known gentleness and a face marked by years of cruelty. His pale eyes swept over the gathered people with the calculating gaze of a predator selecting prey. When those eyes landed on Seraphina, they lingered with an intensity that made the other enslaved people shift uncomfortably. "You there, witch woman?" Whitmore's voice cut through the humid morning air like a blade. "Step forward." Seraphina moved with fluid grace, her bare feet making no sound on the packed earth. She kept her eyes downcast, but there was something in her posture that suggested submission without surrender. The other enslaved people watched in tense silence, knowing that when Whitmore singled someone out, pain was sure to follow. "Master Blackwood's prize roses are wilting," Whitmore announced, his voice carrying across the quarters. "Someone's been practicing dark arts in my fields. Someone thinks they can curse what belongs to a white man." His whip unfurled with a sharp crack that made several children flinch. "What do you know about dead flowers, Seraphina?" "I know nothing about Master's roses, sir," she replied, her voice steady despite the danger crackling in the air around her. Whitmore's laugh was harsh and ugly. "Nothing? But you know about herbs, don't you? About roots and bones and midnight whispers." He stepped closer, close enough that she could smell the whiskey on his breath and see the yellow stain of tobacco on his teeth. "The other slaves come to you when they're sick. They think you can heal them with your heathen magic." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. In the antebellum South, the line between healing and witchcraft was razor thin, and crossing it could mean death. Seraphina's knowledge of medicinal plants, passed down through generations of African wisdom, had indeed made her a source of hope for her people. But that same knowledge made her dangerous in the eyes of men like Whitmore. "I help where I can, sir," she said carefully, "with prayers and simple remedies my grandmother taught me." "Prayers to what god?" Whitmore's voice dropped to a menacing whisper. "The Christian God doesn't listen to the likes of you. So what spirits do you call upon in the dark of night?" Before Seraphina could answer, old Moses stepped forward from the crowd. His back was bent from decades of labor, his hair white as cotton, but his voice still carried the authority of a man who had survived longer than most. "She helps the sick children, Master Whitmore. Ain't nothing evil in easing a child's fever." Whitmore's attention snapped to Moses like a striking snake. "Did I ask for your opinion, old man?" The whip sang through the air and Moses stumbled backward, a line of blood blooming across his weathered cheek. The crack of leather against flesh seemed to awaken something in the very air around them. A wind rose from nowhere, stirring the dust at their feet and setting the Spanish moss in the ancient oaks to swaying. Several of the enslaved people glanced nervously at the sky, which had been clear moments before, but now showed the first grey wisps of gathering clouds. Seraphina's eyes flashed with something that might have been anger, though she quickly lowered her gaze again. "Please, sir," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "Moses meant no disrespect. The fault is mine for drawing your attention." "Yes," Whitmore agreed, coiling his whip with deliberate slowness. "The fault is yours, and faults must be corrected." He gestured toward the whipping post that stood in the center of the quarters like a monument to suffering. 10 lashes for practicing witchcraft, 10 more for corrupting the minds of good Christian slaves. A collective intake of breath rippled through the crowd. 20 lashes could kill a person or leave them broken beyond repair. But as 2 of Whitmore's men moved to seize Seraphina's arms, she did something unexpected. She looked up, meeting the overseer's gaze directly for the first time. "I accept my punishment," she said, and there was something in her voice that made the hair on the back of neck stand up. "But know this, Marcus Whitmore, every action has consequences. Every cruelty plants a seed, and some seeds grow in darkness." The words themselves were not threatening, but the way she spoke them, with the quiet certainty of prophecy, sent a chill through everyone present. Even Whitmore seemed momentarily unsettled, though he quickly masked it with bluster. "Tie her up," he barked. "Let's see how bold your tongue is after you've tasted leather." As they bound Seraphina to the post, the wind grew stronger, and the first drops of rain began to fall despite the morning's clear skies. The other enslaved people watched in horrified silence as Whitmore raised his whip, the leather gleaming wet in the sudden downpour. The first lash fell with a sound like thunder, and Seraphina's body jerked against the ropes, but she made no sound, no cry of pain or plea for mercy. The second lash followed, then the third, each one drawing blood that the rain immediately washed away. It was during the 7th lash that the truly strange things began to happen. The wind, which had been growing steadily stronger, suddenly shifted direction, howling through the quarters with an almost human voice. The rain turned cold, so cold that breath began to mist in the air despite the Alabama heat. And from somewhere in the distance came a sound that made everyone's blood freeze, a low, mournful wailing that seemed to rise from the very earth itself. Whitmore paused, his whip raised for the 8th strike, and looked around with growing unease. The sound was getting closer, and with it came an oppressive feeling of dread that settled over the plantation like a burial shroud. "What in hell's name is that?" one of his men whispered. Before anyone could answer, the wailing stopped as abruptly as it had begun. The wind died to nothing, the rain ceased, and an unnatural silence fell over the quarters. In that silence, Seraphina's voice rang out clear and strong, despite her pain. "The spirits of this land remember every drop of innocent blood spilled upon it," she said, her words carrying with impossible clarity to every ear present. "They remember every child torn from its mother's arms, every back broken by the lash, every soul crushed beneath the weight of chains, and they are not at peace." Whitmore's face had gone pale, but his pride wouldn't let him show weakness before his men and the enslaved people. He raised the whip again, but as he did, something impossible happened. The leather cord began to smoke in his hand, as if touched by invisible fire. With a curse, He dropped it, staring at his palm where angry red welts had appeared. "Witchcraft," someone whispered, and the word spread through the crowd like wildfire. Serafina turned her head to look at Whitmore over her shoulder, and in her dark eyes was a promise that chilled him to the bone. "You wanted to know what spirits I call upon," she said softly. "Perhaps now you'll find out." As if summoned by her words, a murder of crows descended from the grey sky, their harsh cries filling the air as they settled on the roof of every building in the quarters. They sat in perfect silence, hundreds of black eyes fixed on the overseer with an intelligence that seemed almost human. Whitmore stumbled backward, his usual swagger replaced by something that looked dangerously like fear. "Cut her down!" he ordered his men, his voice hoarse. "Get her out of my sight!" As they freed Serafina from the post, she swayed but didn't fall. The wounds on her back were real enough, but there was something in her bearing that suggested the pain hadn't touched whatever lived at her core. She walked back toward her cabin with steady steps, and as she passed each group of enslaved people, they bowed their heads in a gesture that was part respect, part reverence, and part fear. That night, as the plantation settled into an uneasy quiet, strange things began to happen. Doors that had been securely latched swung open on their own. Animals refused to enter certain areas of the grounds, and in the slave quarters, whispered conversations carried a new undercurrent of hope mixed with terror. Serafina sat in her small cabin, tending to her wounds with herbs and salves that seemed to heal faster than they should have. Outside her window, the crows still waited, their dark forms barely visible against the night sky. She spoke to them in a language that predated English, predated slavery, predated the very concept of one human owning another. In the big house, Master Blackwood paced his study, troubled by reports of the day's events. But it was in the overseer's quarters that the real fear had taken root. Marcus Whitmore sat by his window, a loaded pistol in his lap, watching the shadows that seemed to move with purpose through the darkness. He had broken many people in his years as an overseer, had crushed spirits and destroyed hope with methodical efficiency. But something about Serafina was different. Something about the way she had looked at him, the way the very air had seemed to respond to her pain, told him that this time he might have awakened something that couldn't be broken. As midnight approached, the temperature dropped again, and from somewhere in the distance came that same mournful wailing that had stopped his whip mid-strike. This time it seemed to be calling his name. The plantation of silence had found its voice, and it was singing a song of reckoning that would echo through the generations. The mystery of Serafina and the evil spirit she was accused of summoning had only just begun, and already the very foundations of Blackwood Plantation were beginning to crack. In the darkness, something stirred that had been sleeping for far too long, and Marcus Whitmore was about to learn that some seeds of cruelty grow into harvests of terror that no amount of power or privilege can escape. The morning after Serafina's punishment dawned grey and oppressive, as if the very sky mourned what had transpired in the quarters. Word of the strange events had spread like wildfire through the plantation's intricate network of whispered conversations and meaningful glances. By the time the work bell rang, every enslaved person on Blackwood Plantation knew that something fundamental had shifted in their world. In the kitchen of the big house, elderly Aunt Celia kneaded bread with hands that trembled slightly as she worked. She had been on the plantation longer than anyone, had seen masters come and go, had witnessed horrors that would have broken lesser souls. But what she had observed yesterday filled her with a mixture of hope and terror that she struggled to contain. "That girl's got the sight," she murmured to her assistant, young Mercy, who was barely 16 and still learning the delicate art of serving in the master's house. Just like her grandmother before her and her grandmother's grandmother, it runs in the blood, child, runs deep as river water. Mercy's eyes widened as she continued churning butter. What kind of sight, Aunt Celia? The older woman glanced around nervously before leaning closer. The kind that sees beyond the veil, child. The kind that knows things before they happen, that can call upon powers older than this cursed plantation. She crossed herself quickly. Her grandmother could heal with a touch, could make barren women fertile, could ease the passing of the dying. But she could do other things too, darker things when the need arose. Is it true what they're saying, that she called up a spirit to curse Overseer Whitmore? Aunt Celia's weathered face grew grave. I don't know what she called up, child. But I know this. That man has been marked. I can smell it on him, like sulfur and grave dirt. Whatever's coming for him, it's been a long time in the making. Meanwhile, in the quarters, Serafina moved through her daily routine with a quiet dignity that seemed untouched by the previous day's brutality. Her back bore the marks of Whitmore's whip, but she showed no sign of pain as she tended to the sick and injured among her people. If anything, her healing touch seemed more potent than before, as if the violence inflicted upon her had somehow strengthened rather than weakened her abilities. Old Moses sat outside his cabin, whittling a piece of wood with hands that had crafted countless small comforts for his fellow slaves over the decades. The cut on his cheek from Whitmore's whip had healed overnight, leaving only a thin white line that looked like it had been there for years rather than hours. She touched it, he told anyone who would listen, just brushed her fingers across the wound when she passed by last night, and the pain just went away. Ain't natural, the way that girl can heal. But then again, ain't nothing natural about the way we're forced to live either. As word of Serafina's enhanced abilities spread, a steady stream of the sick and suffering began to make their way to her cabin. Children with fever, women with difficult pregnancies, men whose backs had been broken by years of brutal labor, all came seeking the relief that only she could provide. And remarkably, impossibly, she was able to help them all. But it wasn't just her healing powers that had people talking. It was the other things, the way animals seemed drawn to her, the way plants flourished wherever she walked, the way she sometimes spoke of events before they happened with an accuracy that was both comforting and terrifying. "Storm's coming tomorrow night," she told a group of field hands as they gathered around her cabin in the evening. "Big one. Lightning will strike the old oak by the creek, split it right down the middle. Best keep the children inside." Dichin, the next evening, as if summoned by her words, a massive thunderstorm rolled across the plantation. Lightning illuminated the sky in brilliant flashes, and with a crack that could be heard for miles, the ancient oak by the creek was indeed split in two, just as Serafina had predicted. Word of this latest demonstration of her abilities reached the big house, where Master Blackwood sat in his study, nursing a glass of bourbon and trying to make sense of the reports filtering up from the quarters. He was a practical man, educated at the University of Virginia, and he had little patience for what he considered superstitious nonsense. But the consistency of the accounts was troubling. "Perhaps we should sell her," suggested his wife Margaret, as she embroidered by the fireplace. "Before whatever madness has taken hold spreads further." Blackwood considered this, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "She's worth too much," he said finally. "Strong, healthy, good breeding stock, and the others respect her. Sometimes it's better to have a leader you can control than to scatter the flock and risk rebellion." But control was exactly what was slipping away from the plantation's white masters. In the quarters, Serafina had become something more than just another enslaved person. She had become a symbol of power that couldn't be broken, of knowledge that couldn't be destroyed, of hope that refused to die. It was during this time that the stories began to emerge about her past, whispered tales that painted a picture of a woman whose abilities had been evident from childhood. They said her mother had been a powerful healer in her own right, brought to America on a slave ship from the Gold Coast of Africa. They said she had carried with her the ancient knowledge of her people, the secrets of herbs and roots, the ability to speak with spirits, the power to call upon forces that existed beyond the understanding of white men. "My grandmother told me," said Sarah, a young woman who worked in the cotton fields, "that Seraphina's mother could make herself invisible when the slave catchers came, could walk right past them like she was made of air. And when she gave birth to Seraphina, the midwife said the child was born with a caul over her face, a sure sign of the second sight." The caul, that thin membrane that sometimes covered newborns, was considered a powerful omen in many African traditions. Children born with the caul were said to be blessed with the ability to see spirits, to predict the future, to walk between the world of the living and the world of the dead. As these stories spread, Seraphina's reputation grew beyond the boundaries of Blackwood Plantation. Enslaved people from neighboring farms began to seek her out, traveling dangerous distances in the dead of night to receive her healing touch or to hear her prophecies. They brought with them tales of their own suffering, their own desperate need for hope, and Seraphina welcomed them all. But with this growing reputation came increased scrutiny from the white community. Overseer Whitmore, still shaken by his encounter with whatever forces Seraphina commanded, began to watch her with an obsession that bordered on madness. He followed her movements, questioned anyone who spoke with her, and searched her cabin repeatedly for evidence of the witchcraft he was certain she practiced. It was during one of these searches that he found them. Small bundles of herbs and roots hidden beneath loose floorboards, along with carved bones, smooth stones, and other items that he didn't recognize, but that filled him with instinctive dread. He confiscated everything, burning most of it in a bonfire that sent acrid smoke billowing across the quarters. But if he expected this to break Seraphina's power, he was sorely mistaken. If anything, the destruction of her materials seemed to liberate something within her, as if she no longer needed physical tools to channel whatever forces she commanded. That night, as Whitmore lay in his bed, he was awakened by the sound of singing. It was a low, mournful melody in a language he didn't recognize, but somehow the meaning was clear. It was a song of judgment, of reckoning, of debts that would soon come due. He rose and went to his window, and there in the moonlight he saw Seraphina standing in the center of the quarters, her arms raised to the sky, her voice carrying across the plantation like a prayer and a curse combined. Around her, the other enslaved people had emerged from their cabins, and they stood in a great circle, swaying to the rhythm of her song. Their voices joined hers, creating a harmony that seemed to resonate in the very bones of the earth. And as they sang, the temperature began to drop, and shadows that had no earthly source began to move among them. Whitmore reached for his rifle, but his hands were shaking so badly he could barely hold it. The singing continued, growing louder and more intense until it seemed to fill the entire world. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The silence that followed was absolute and terrifying. Whitmore strained his eyes, trying to see what was happening in the quarters, but the moonlight seemed to have dimmed, as if something was absorbing the very light itself. When dawn finally came, he found the quarters empty, except for Seraphina, who sat calmly outside her cabin, grinding herbs with a mortar and pestle that definitely hadn't been there the night before. "Where did everyone go?" he demanded, his voice hoarse from fear and sleeplessness. She looked up at him with those dark eyes that seemed to see straight through to his soul. "They went to work, Master Whitmore, just like they do every morning, just like they've been doing all their lives." But when he checked the fields, he found the enslaved people already at their tasks, working with an efficiency and coordination that seemed almost supernatural. They moved as if guided by a single mind, their actions perfectly synchronized, their faces bearing expressions of quiet determination that he had never seen before. It was then that Marcus Whitmore began to understand that he was no longer dealing with just one woman who might or might not possess unusual abilities. He was facing something far more dangerous, a community that had found its voice, its power, its unity, and at the center of it all was Serafina, the woman who knew too much, who saw too clearly, who remembered too well. The slave who had been marked as a witch was becoming something far more threatening to the established order. She was becoming a leader, a prophet, a symbol of resistance that no amount of violence could destroy. And as the days passed and her influence continued to grow, it became clear that the real mystery wasn't whether she had summoned an evil spirit to curse her oppressors. The real mystery was what would happen when that spirit finally arrived to collect what was owed. Marcus Whitmore had always prided himself on being a man who feared nothing. In his 38 years, he had broken wild horses, faced down armed runaways, and stared into the eyes of desperate men without flinching. Fear was a luxury he couldn't afford in his line of work. It was a weakness that could get a man killed on a plantation where maintaining absolute control meant the difference between order and chaos. But now, as he sat in his quarters 3 days after the midnight singing, fear had become his constant companion. It followed him like a shadow, whispered in his ear during the day, and invaded his dreams at night. The rational part of his mind insisted that what he was experiencing was nothing more than guilt and paranoia, the natural result of years spent inflicting cruelty on other human beings. But the deeper, more primitive part of his brain knew better. Something was hunting him. It had started with small things. Objects moved from where he had left them, doors that opened on their own, the persistent feeling of being watched even when he was completely alone. His rifle, which he cleaned religiously every evening, would be found dirty the next morning, as if someone had been handling it with muddy hands. His boots, left by the door, would be discovered in the morning filled with graveyard dirt that smelled of decay and old bones. The other white men on the plantation had begun to notice his deteriorating condition. His hands shook when he thought no one was looking. His eyes darted constantly to shadows that held nothing, and his voice had taken on a sharp, brittle quality that spoke of nerves stretched to the breaking point. "You look like hell, Marcus," observed Thomas Hartwell, Master Blackwood's nephew, as they shared a drink on the porch of the big house. "When's the last time you got a decent night's sleep?" Whitmore's laugh was harsh and humorless. "Sleep? You try sleeping when every sound in the night might be your last." He took a long pull from his whiskey bottle, noting with disgust that his hand trembled as he raised it to his lips. "That witch has cursed me, Thomas. I can feel it eating away at me like a cancer." "Come now," Hartwell said, though his voice lacked conviction. "You don't really believe in that nonsense, do you? She's just a slave with a talent for herbs and a gift for theatrics. Nothing more." But even as he spoke the words, Hartwell found himself glancing nervously toward the quarters, where smoke from cooking fires rose into the evening sky like incense from some unholy altar. The truth was, everyone on the plantation had noticed the changes since Serafina's punishment. The enslaved people moved with a new sense of purpose. Their work was completed with an efficiency that bordered on the supernatural, and there was something in their eyes, a quiet confidence that hadn't been there before. Whitmore set down his bottle and leaned forward, his pale eyes intense with desperation. "You want to know what I really believe? I believe that woman has tapped into something that was here long before we were. Something that's been waiting in the shadows for the right moment to strike back. And I believe It's coming for me. As if summoned by his words, a murder of crows suddenly erupted from the trees surrounding the big house, their harsh cries filling the air as they wheeled overhead in perfect formation. Both men watched in uneasy silence as the birds circled 3 times before settling on the roof of the overseer's quarters, where they perched in absolute stillness, their black eyes fixed on Whitmore with an intelligence that seemed almost human. "They've been doing that for days," Whitmore whispered, "following me everywhere I go, watching everything I do. Sometimes I swear I can hear them talking to each other, planning something." And that night, alone in his quarters, Whitmore tried to fortify himself with alcohol and prayer, but neither seemed to offer any protection against the terror that was slowly consuming him. He had nailed boards over his windows, barricaded his door, and kept his rifle loaded and within arm's reach. But none of these precautions could stop the sounds that began just after midnight. It started as a low humming, so faint he almost convinced himself he was imagining it. But gradually it grew louder, resolving into what sounded like a woman's voice singing a lullaby in a language he didn't recognize. The melody was hauntingly beautiful and utterly terrifying, carrying with it overtones of loss and longing that seemed to reach directly into his soul. Whitmore pressed his hands over his ears, but the singing continued, seeming to come from inside his own head now. With it came images, flashes of memory that weren't his own. He saw a young African woman, torn from her children and loaded onto a slave ship. He saw families separated on auction blocks, children sold away from their mothers, men worked to death in cotton fields under the blazing sun. He saw his own face, twisted with cruelty, as he brought the whip down again and again on backs that bore the scars of previous beatings. "Stop!" he whispered, then louder. "Stop! I was just doing my job. I was maintaining order." But the visions continued, and with them came a presence. Something vast and ancient and filled with a rage that had been building for centuries. It pressed against the walls of his consciousness like a tide of darkness, and he could feel his sanity beginning to crack under the pressure. The singing stopped abruptly, leaving behind a silence that was somehow worse than the sound had been. In that silence, Whitmore heard footsteps on his porch, slow, deliberate steps that circled his cabin like a predator stalking its prey. He grabbed his rifle and crept to the window, peering through a gap in the boards. There was nothing there. The porch was empty, bathed in pale moonlight that revealed no sign of an intruder. But the footsteps continued, and now they were accompanied by a new sound, the soft scraping of fingernails against wood, as if someone was clawing at the walls of his cabin. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice cracking with fear. "Show yourself!" The scraping stopped, and for a moment there was only the sound of his own ragged breathing. Then, from directly behind him, came a voice that made his blood freeze in his veins. "You know who I am." Whitmore spun around, rifle raised, but the cabin was empty. There was no one there, no sign that anyone had ever been there. But the voice had been real, a woman's voice, soft and sad and filled with an authority that transcended the physical world. "You're not real," he whispered to the empty room. "You're just in my head, just guilt and whiskey and too many sleepless nights." "I am as real as the pain you have caused," the voice replied, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "As real as the tears you have shed, the blood you have spilled, the lives you have destroyed. I am the sum of all your cruelties, Marcus Whitmore, and I have come to collect what is owed." The temperature in the cabin began to drop, and Whitmore's breath started to mist in the suddenly frigid air. Frost began to form on the windows, and the flame in his oil lamp flickered and dimmed, as if something was drawing the very warmth from the room. "What do you want?" he asked, his teeth chattering from cold and terror. "Justice," came the reply. "Balance. An accounting for the debts you have accumulated over the years. You have taken so much, Marcus Whitmore. Now it is time to give something back. The lamp flame guttered and died, plunging the cabin into absolute darkness. In that darkness, Whitmore heard movement, the soft whisper of fabric, the gentle pad of bare feet on wooden floors. Something was in the room with him, something that radiated cold and sorrow and an implacable determination that terrified him more than any physical threat ever could. "Please," he whispered into the darkness, "I'll change. I'll be better. I'll treat them with kindness." A sound that might have been laughter echoed through the cabin, but there was no humor in it, only the bitter amusement of someone who had heard such promises before and knew exactly how much they were worth. "Kindness?" the voice asked. "From you, the man who takes pleasure in others' pain, the man who sees human beings as property to be broken and used? No, Marcus Whitmore, it is far too late for kindness." The darkness seemed to press against him from all sides, and Whitmore felt something brush against his face, fingers as cold as winter wind, tracing the contours of his features with a gentleness that was somehow more terrifying than violence would have been. "You will know fear," the voice whispered, so close now that he could feel breath against his ear. "You will know helplessness. You will know what it feels like to be at the mercy of something stronger than yourself, something that sees you as less than human. And when you have learned these lessons, when you have truly understood what you have done to others, then perhaps we can discuss what comes next." The presence withdrew as suddenly as it had arrived, and the lamp flame sprang back to life, filling the cabin with warm yellow light. Whitmore found himself alone again, but the terror remained, clinging to him like a second skin. He looked down at his hands and saw that they were covered in frost, though the cabin was now warm again. On the table beside his bed, written in what looked like condensation on the wooden surface, were words in a script he didn't recognize, but somehow understood. "This is only the beginning." As dawn broke over Blackwood Plantation, Marcus Whitmore emerged from his cabin a changed man. His hair, which had been brown the night before, was now streaked with white. His eyes held a haunted quality that spoke of horrors witnessed and terrors yet to come. And when he looked toward the quarters, where Serafina could be seen tending to her morning tasks with serene efficiency, he felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. The other white men on the plantation noticed the change immediately. Whitmore's usual swagger was gone, replaced by a nervous, darting gait that suggested a man constantly looking over his shoulder. His voice, when he spoke at all, was hoarse and strained. And his hands shook constantly now, making it difficult for him to perform even simple tasks. "What happened to you?" Master Blackwood demanded when Whitmore reported for his morning briefing. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Whitmore's laugh was high and brittle. "Maybe I have, sir. Maybe I have." But even as he tried to maintain some semblance of normalcy, Whitmore knew that his ordeal was far from over. The presence that had visited him in the night had made it clear that this was only the beginning. Whatever Serafina had summoned, whatever force she had called upon to balance the scales of justice, it was patient and methodical and utterly implacable. And as the days passed and the terror continued to build, Marcus Whitmore began to understand that he was not just being haunted, he was being hunted. Something was stalking him through the shadows of his own guilt, and it would not rest until it had extracted every ounce of suffering that he had inflicted upon others. The overseer who had ruled through fear was about to learn what it truly meant to be afraid. The air hung thick and oppressive over Blackwood Plantation as October's end approached, carrying with it the weight of secrets and the promise of revelation. For weeks, Marcus Whitmore had been slowly unraveling, his once commanding presence reduced to that of a man perpetually glancing over his shoulder, jumping at shadows that seemed to move with purpose. The enslaved people had noticed, of course. They noticed everything that happened on the plantation, filing away each detail like intelligence gathered for some future reckoning. Serafina moved through her daily routines with the same quiet dignity she had always possessed, but those who knew how to look could see the change in her. There was a new intensity in her dark eyes, a sense of gathering power that seemed to grow stronger with each passing day. The herbs, she gathered, were different now, plants that grew in hidden places, roots that had to be harvested under specific conditions, flowers that bloomed only in darkness. Old Moses watched her preparations with a mixture of awe and trepidation. He had seen powerful conjure women before, had witnessed rituals that could heal the sick or curse the wicked, but what Serafina was planning felt different. This wasn't just about herbs and roots and whispered prayers. This was about calling upon forces that had been sleeping in the earth since long before white men had ever set foot on this continent. "Child," he said to her one evening as she sorted through her collection of mysterious items, "you sure you know what you're doing? Some doors, once opened, can't be closed again." Serafina looked up from her work, and Moses saw something in her expression that made him take an involuntary step backward. It wasn't cruelty or madness. It was the absolute certainty of someone who had looked into the abyss and found it looking back with approval. "I know exactly what I'm doing, Uncle Moses," she replied, her voice carrying an authority that seemed to resonate in the very air around them. "I'm calling in a debt that's been accumulating for far too long. I'm summoning justice for every child sold away from their mother, every back broken by the lash, every soul crushed under the weight of chains." "And what if that justice comes for all of us?" Moses asked quietly. "What if whatever you're calling up can't tell the difference between the guilty and the innocent?" Serafina's smile was sad, but determined. "The spirits know the difference, Uncle Moses. They've been watching, waiting, keeping account of every cruelty and every kindness. They know who deserves their protection and who deserves their wrath." They see. As the night of the new moon approached, the darkest night of the month, when the veil between worlds was thinnest, word spread through the quarters in the way that important information always traveled among enslaved people, through meaningful glances, whispered conversations, and a network of communication that existed entirely outside the awareness of their white masters. Something was going to happen, something that would change everything. The day itself passed, with an unusual tension that even the white residents of the plantation couldn't ignore. The enslaved people went about their work with mechanical efficiency, but there was an undercurrent of anticipation that made the air itself seem to vibrate with potential energy. Animals behaved strangely. Horses refused to enter certain areas of the plantation, dogs whined and cowered for no apparent reason, and the ever-present crows gathered in numbers that defied explanation. Master Blackwood found himself increasingly agitated as the day wore on, though he couldn't pinpoint the source of his unease. His wife Margaret complained of headaches and retired to her room early, claiming that the very air felt heavy with malevolence. Even young Thomas Hartwell, usually dismissive of what he called slave superstitions, seemed on edge, jumping at unexpected sounds and avoiding the windows that looked out toward the quarters. But it was Marcus Whitmore who bore the brunt of the day's oppressive atmosphere. The presence that had been tormenting him for weeks seemed stronger now, more focused, as if it were gathering itself for some final confrontation. He found himself unable to eat, unable to concentrate on even the simplest tasks. His hands shook so badly that he could barely hold his rifle, and his eyes darted constantly to shadows that seemed to writhe with malevolent life. As evening approached, Whitmore barricaded himself in his quarters, nailing additional boards over his windows and pushing furniture against his door. He had filled every container he could find with holy water from the plantation's chapel, had scattered salt across his threshold, and had armed himself with both his rifle and a collection of religious artifacts that he hoped might offer some protection against whatever was coming. But even as he made these preparations, he knew they would be useless. Whatever Serafina had summoned wasn't something that could be stopped by conventional means. It was older than Christianity, more powerful than any human weapon, and it had been waiting for this moment for far longer than he could imagine. As midnight approached, the temperature began to drop despite the warm October air. Frost formed on windows throughout the plantation, and a mist rose from the ground that seemed to glow with its own pale light. In the quarters, the enslaved people emerged from their cabins one by one, moving with the synchronized precision of a well-rehearsed ritual. They gathered in the center of the quarters, forming a large circle around a space that had been carefully prepared with symbols drawn in white chalk and red clay. At the cardinal points of the circle, small fires burned in iron braziers, their flames dancing in colors that had no earthly source, deep purples and electric blues that seemed to pulse with otherworldly energy. Serafina stood at the center of it all, no longer dressed in the rough homespun clothing of a slave, but in robes that seemed to be woven from shadow and starlight. Her hair, usually bound and hidden, flowed freely around her shoulders like a dark river, and her skin seemed to glow with an inner light that made her appear almost ethereal. In her hands, she held items that defied easy description. Bones carved with symbols that hurt to look at directly, stones that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, and bundles of herbs that gave off scents both beautiful and terrible. Around her neck hung an amulet that Moses recognized from stories his own grandmother had told him, a piece of meteoric iron shaped into the form of a serpent eating its own tail, a symbol of eternal cycles and cosmic justice. The ritual began with singing, not the Christian hymns that the enslaved people were forced to perform for their masters, but something far older and more primal. The melody seemed to rise from the earth itself, carried on voices that had been trained in traditions that predated written history. The words were in languages that had been spoken in Africa before the first slave ship ever crossed the Atlantic, and they called upon powers that had been worshipped when the world was young. As the singing continued, the very air around the circle began to change. The mist grew thicker, taking on shapes that suggested forms just beyond the edge of perception. The flames in the braziers leaped higher, casting shadows that moved independently of their sources, and from somewhere in the distance came the sound of drums, not physical drums, but the rhythmic beating of something vast and cosmic, like the heartbeat of the earth itself. Serafina raised her arms to the star-filled sky and began to speak in a voice that carried far beyond what should have been physically possible. Her words reached every corner of the plantation, penetrating walls and distance, as if the very air itself was carrying her message. "Spirits of the ancestors," she called out, her voice resonating with power and authority. "Hear my plea. You who were torn from your homeland, you who suffered and died in chains, you who were denied justice in life, I call upon you now to witness what has been done in your name." The temperature dropped further, and the mist began to coalesce into forms that were almost human. Tall, shadowy figures that stood at the edge of the circle like silent witnesses to the proceedings. Their eyes glowed with a cold light that seemed to see through flesh and bone to the very soul beneath. "I call upon the spirits of this land," Serafina continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "You who were here before the first ship arrived, you who watched as your sacred places were defiled and your children enslaved. I call upon you to remember every injustice, every cruelty, every drop of innocent blood spilled upon your soil." The ground beneath the circle began to tremble, and from deep in the earth came a sound like the groaning of ancient wood or the shifting of massive stones. The shadowy figures at the edge of the circle grew more distinct, And now they were joined by others, spirits that seemed to rise from the very soil, their forms shifting between human and something far more elemental. "And I call upon you, great spirit of justice." Seraphina's voice rose to a crescendo that seemed to shake the very foundations of the plantation. "You who weigh the hearts of men and find them wanting, you who balance the scales of cosmic law, I offer myself as your vessel, your instrument of retribution. Through me, let justice be done. Through me, let the guilty face the consequences of their actions." Lightning flashed across the clear sky, and thunder rolled across the plantation like the voice of an angry god. The wind rose to a howling gale that bent trees and rattled windows, but within the circle the air was perfectly still. The enslaved people continued their singing, their voices now joined by others, the voices of the dead, of the ancestors, of spirits that had been waiting centuries for this moment. In his barricaded quarters, Marcus Whitmore felt the full force of what was being summoned. The walls of his cabin began to shake, and the religious artifacts he had gathered for protection began to smoke and crack, as if exposed to intense heat. The holy water in his containers began to boil, and the salt he had scattered across his threshold turned black as coal. "No," he whispered, pressing himself against the far wall of his cabin, as something began to materialize in the center of the room. "No, this isn't real. This can't be happening." But it was happening, and the thing that was taking shape before his terrified eyes was more terrible than anything his worst nightmares had ever conjured. It was tall and gaunt, with skin like polished obsidian and eyes that burned with the cold fire of distant stars. Its presence filled the room with an aura of such overwhelming malevolence that Whitmore felt his sanity beginning to crack like glass under pressure. "Marcus Whitmore," the entity spoke, its voice like the sound of wind through a graveyard. "You have been judged and found wanting. The scales of justice demand balance, and you will provide it." Back in the circle, Seraphina's ritual reached its climax. The spirits that had gathered around the circle began to move, flowing like water toward the center, where she stood with her arms still raised to the sky. As they touched her, she began to change, her form becoming more luminous, more powerful, as if she were being transformed into something beyond human limitations. "It is done," she said, and her voice now carried the authority of cosmic law itself. "The spirit has been summoned, the debt acknowledged, the reckoning begun. Let those who have sown cruelty reap terror. Let those who have dealt in suffering know suffering in return, and let justice, so long delayed, finally be served." The ritual circle erupted in a pillar of light that reached toward the heavens, visible for miles around. When it faded, the enslaved people found themselves alone in the quarters. But they knew that something fundamental had changed. The air itself felt different, charged with potential, heavy with the promise of transformation. In the big house, Master Blackwood and his family huddled together, trying to understand what they had witnessed. The light had been impossible to ignore, and the sounds that had accompanied it, the singing, the thunder, the otherworldly voices, had filled them with a terror that went beyond rational explanation. But it was in the overseer's quarters that the true impact of the night's events was most apparent. Marcus Whitmore sat in the corner of his cabin, his rifle forgotten, his eyes wide with the kind of fear that breaks men's minds. The entity that had appeared to him was gone, but its promise remained. Justice would be served, balance would be restored, and he would pay for every cruelty he had ever inflicted. The night of the invocation was over, but its consequences were just beginning. Something had been awakened that night, something that would not rest until every debt had been paid and every injustice answered. The enslaved people of Blackwood Plantation had called upon powers older than civilization itself, and those powers had answered. Now all that remained was to see what form their justice would take. The morning after the invocation dawned blood-red, with clouds that hung low and heavy like a shroud over Blackwood Plantation. The air itself seemed different, thicker, more oppressive, charged with an energy that made every living thing on the plantation nervous and agitated. Birds refused to sing, horses shied away from their own shadows, and even the insects seemed to have gone silent, as if nature itself was holding its breath in anticipation of what was to come. Marcus Whitmore had not slept. He sat in the corner of his cabin, his back pressed against the wall, his eyes fixed on the spot where the entity had materialized the night before. The floorboards there were scorched black, and the air above them shimmered with heat distortion despite the cool morning air. Every few minutes, he thought he could see movement in his peripheral vision, shadows that shouldn't exist, shapes that defied explanation, but when he turned to look directly, there was nothing there. His hands, which had been shaking for weeks, now trembled so violently that he could barely hold a cup of water to his lips. His hair, already streaked with premature white, had turned completely grey overnight, and his eyes held the hollow look of a man who had seen too much and understood too little. When he tried to speak, his voice came out as a hoarse whisper, as if something had damaged his vocal cords from the inside. The first sign that the entity summoned by Seraphina's ritual was more than just a figment of guilty imagination came at sunrise, when the plantation's overseer dogs, 3 massive mastiffs trained to track runaway slaves, were found dead in their kennel. There were no visible wounds on their bodies, no signs of struggle or violence. They simply lay there with their eyes wide open, their faces frozen in expressions of absolute terror, as if they had been literally frightened to death. Master Blackwood discovered the bodies himself when he went to check on the animals, and the sight filled him with a dread that he couldn't quite articulate. These were not ordinary dogs. They were bred for aggression and fearlessness, trained to pursue and attack human beings without hesitation. What could have terrified such creatures so completely that their hearts simply stopped beating? "Get rid of them," he ordered the stable hands, his voice tight with barely controlled fear. "Burn the bodies and don't speak of this to anyone." But word of the dog's mysterious death spread through the plantation like wildfire, carried on the same invisible network of communication that had announced the previous night's ritual. The enslaved people received the news with a mixture of satisfaction and apprehension. Satisfaction that the instruments of their oppression were being removed one by one. Apprehension about what other changes might be coming. Seraphina moved through her morning routine as if nothing had happened, tending to the sick and injured with the same gentle efficiency she had always shown. But those who looked closely could see that she had been changed by the previous night's events. There was a new quality to her presence, an aura of power that seemed to bend reality around her, like light around a massive star. When she touched someone, they didn't just feel healed. They felt transformed, as if some essential part of their being had been restored or awakened. "She's different now," whispered Sarah, the young field hand, to her friend Rebecca as they watched Seraphina tend to old Jonas, whose arthritis had plagued him for years. "Look at her hands. They're glowing." It was true. Seraphina's hands seemed to emit a soft, warm light as she worked, and wherever she touched, pain simply vanished. Jonas, who hadn't been able to straighten his back in months, stood upright for the first time in years, tears streaming down his weathered face. "Praise be," he whispered. "Praise be to the spirits that watch over us." But if Seraphina's power brought healing and hope to the enslaved people, it brought something very different to those who had oppressed them. The entity that had been summoned was not content to simply terrorize Marcus Whitmore. It had work to do, debts to collect, justice to dispense. The second manifestation came at midday, when Thomas Hartwell was inspecting the cotton fields. He was walking between the rows, checking the quality of the harvest, when he suddenly stopped and began to stare at something that no one else could see. His face went pale, then grey, and he began to back away from whatever he was looking at with the slow, careful movements of someone trying not to provoke a dangerous animal. "Thomas!" called out one of the field supervisors. "What's wrong?" But Hartwell couldn't answer. He was transfixed by the sight before him, a figure that seemed to be made of shadow and smoke, with eyes like burning coals and a presence that radiated malevolence, like heat from a forge. The figure was tall and gaunt, dressed in the tattered remains of what might once have been fine clothing, and it moved with the fluid grace of something that was no longer bound by the laws of physics. As Hartwell watched in horror, the figure began to speak, its voice like the sound of wind through a cemetery at midnight. But the words it spoke were not directed at him. They were the voices of the dead, the enslaved people who had died on this very plantation over the years, and they were recounting their suffering in excruciating detail. He heard the voice of a young woman who had died in childbirth because she was denied medical care. He heard the voice of a man who had been worked to death in the cotton fields, his body pushed beyond all human endurance. He heard the voice of a child who had been sold away from her mother and died of heartbreak before she reached her 10th birthday. The voices came faster now, overlapping and interweaving into a chorus of accusation that seemed to penetrate directly into Hartwell's soul. Each story was a weight added to his conscience, each death a stone placed upon his chest until he could barely breathe. He tried to run, but his legs wouldn't obey him. He tried to scream, but no sound would come from his throat. The entity moved closer, and as it did, Hartwell began to see his own reflection in its burning eyes. But it wasn't the reflection of the man he was now. It was the reflection of every cruel act he had ever committed, every moment of callous indifference to human suffering, every time he had looked upon enslaved people as property rather than human beings. "You knew," the entity whispered, its voice now speaking directly into his mind. "You knew they were people, with hearts and souls and dreams just like your own. But you chose to see them as things, as tools to be used and discarded. And now you will know what it feels like to be seen as less than human." Hartwell's scream, when it finally came, was heard across the entire plantation. It was a sound of pure terror and anguish that seemed to go on forever, echoing off the buildings and rolling across the fields like thunder. When the field supervisors reached him, they found him collapsed in the dirt, his hair turned white, his eyes staring sightlessly at the sky. He was alive, but something essential had been broken inside him. When they tried to help him to his feet, he flinched away from their touch, as if it burned him. When they spoke to him, he responded only with whimpers and incoherent babbling about voices and shadows and debts that could never be repaid. Word of Hartwell's breakdown reached the big house within the hour, and Master Blackwood found himself facing a crisis that he was completely unprepared to handle. 2 of his most trusted men had been reduced to gibbering wrecks in the space of 24 hours. His guard dogs were dead, and an atmosphere of supernatural dread had settled over his plantation like a plague. "We need to bring in a priest," his wife Margaret insisted, her voice shrill with barely controlled hysteria. "Or someone who understands these things. This is beyond anything we can handle ourselves." But Blackwood knew that no priest would be able to help them. Whatever had been unleashed on his plantation was older and more powerful than any Christian ritual could contain. It was something primal and elemental, a force of nature that had been awakened by centuries of accumulated injustice. As evening approached, the entity's presence became more pronounced throughout the plantation. Shadows moved independently of their sources, temperatures dropped without warning, and a sound like distant weeping could be heard coming from empty rooms. The enslaved people, rather than being terrified by these manifestations, seemed to draw strength from them. They moved with new confidence, spoke with new authority, and looked upon their white masters with eyes that held no fear. It was during the dinner hour that the entity made its most dramatic appearance yet. The Blackwood family was gathered in their dining room, trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy, despite the chaos that was consuming their world, when the temperature in the room suddenly plummeted. Their breath began to mist in the frigid air, and frost started to form on the windows, despite the warm October evening outside. The candles on the table flickered and dimmed, and in the growing darkness, a figure began to materialize at the head of the table. It was the same entity that had terrorized Whitmore and broken Hartwell's mind, but now it appeared in its full, terrible glory, a being of shadow and starlight, of ancient power and cosmic justice. "Edmund Blackwood," it spoke, its voice like the sound of wind through a graveyard. "You who call yourself master of this land and these people, you will hear the testimony of those you have wronged." The air around the table began to shimmer, and suddenly the dining room was filled with figures, the spirits of every enslaved person who had ever died on Blackwood Plantation. They stood in silent accusation, their eyes fixed on the family that had profited from their suffering, their presence a living indictment of the system that had destroyed so many lives. Master Blackwood tried to speak, tried to assert his authority, but the words died in his throat. The weight of all those accusing eyes, all those silent testimonies, pressed down upon him like a physical force. His wife had fainted dead away, and his children huddled together in terror, unable to comprehend the magnitude of what they were witnessing. "You built your wealth on their bones," the entity continued, its voice growing stronger with each word. "You fed your family with the fruits of their labor, clothed yourselves with cotton picked by their bleeding hands, lived in comfort while they suffered in squalor. And you told yourself it was natural, that it was God's will, that they were less than human and deserved no better." The spirits began to move, circling the table like a jury delivering its verdict. As they passed, each one whispered a single word, "Guilty," until the air was filled with a chorus of condemnation that seemed to shake the very foundations of the house. But they were human. The entity's voice rose to a crescendo that rattled the windows and made the walls tremble. They had names and families and dreams. They loved and hoped and suffered just as you do, and their blood cries out from the ground for justice, for balance, for the scales to be set right. The manifestation lasted only minutes, but its impact was devastating. When the spirits faded and the entity withdrew, the Blackwood family was left shattered and broken, their worldview destroyed, their sense of superiority revealed as the hollow lie it had always been. Throughout the plantation, the enslaved people felt the change like a shift in the very fabric of reality. The power structure that had defined their lives for so long was crumbling, and in its place something new was being born, something that recognized their humanity, their dignity, their right to justice. Serafina stood in the doorway of her cabin, watching the big house where lights flickered frantically as the Blackwood family tried to come to terms with what they had experienced. She felt the entity's presence like a warm embrace, a cosmic force that had finally answered the prayers of generations of the oppressed. "It is done," she whispered to the night air. "The spirit has been awakened, the truth has been revealed, and justice will be served." But even as she spoke these words, Serafina knew that this was only the beginning. The entity that had been summoned was not content with mere terror and revelation. It demanded true justice, true balance, true reckoning for centuries of accumulated wrongs. The evil spirit that the white residents of the plantation feared was not evil at all. It was justice personified, cosmic law made manifest, the inevitable consequence of actions that had gone unpunished for far too long. And it would not rest until every debt had been paid, every wrong had been righted, and every soul that had suffered in bondage had been avenged. The night was far from over, and the reckoning had only just begun. Dawn broke grey and sullen over Blackwood Plantation, revealing a world transformed by the previous night's supernatural reckoning. The big house, once a symbol of unshakable white supremacy, now stood like a monument to shattered illusions, its windows dark and its occupants cowering behind locked doors. The very air seemed different, cleaner somehow, as if a poison that had been seeping into the earth for generations was finally being purged. In the quarters, the enslaved people moved with a new sense of purpose and dignity. The fear that had defined their existence for so long was being replaced by something far more powerful: hope. They gathered in small groups, speaking in hushed but excited tones about the events they had witnessed, about the justice that was finally being served, about the possibility that their long nightmare might actually be coming to an end. Serafina stood at the center of it all, no longer just a healer and wise woman, but something approaching a prophet. The entity she had summoned continued to work through her, granting her insights into truths that had been buried beneath layers of lies and deliberate ignorance. She could see the connections now, the web of complicity that extended far beyond the boundaries of Blackwood Plantation, the network of banks and merchants and politicians who had all profited from the suffering of her people. But it was the immediate truths, the secrets hidden within the plantation itself, that demanded her attention first. The entity had shown her things during the night, visions of events that had been carefully concealed, of crimes that had been covered up, of horrors that the white residents of the plantation had convinced themselves never happened. "Gather everyone," she told Moses as the morning work bell rang across the plantation. "There are things they need to know, truths that have been hidden too long. The spirits have shown me where the bodies are buried." Moses felt a chill run down his spine at her words. He had suspected for years that there were dark secrets hidden on the plantation, had heard whispered rumors of enslaved people who had simply vanished without explanation. But he had never dared to investigate too deeply, knowing that such knowledge could be deadly for someone in his position. "What bodies, child?" he asked, though part of him already knew he didn't want to hear the answer. Serafina's eyes held depths of sorrow that seemed to encompass generations of suffering. The ones who tried to escape, the ones who fought back, the ones who knew too much or spoke too freely. They didn't run away, Uncle Moses. They were murdered, and their bodies hidden to maintain the lie that this plantation was somehow more civilized than others. As word spread through the quarters, a crowd began to gather around Serafina. Men and women who had worked the fields for decades, children who had been born into bondage, elderly people who remembered the early days of the plantation. All came to hear what truths the spirits had revealed.